The secret funding documents that Lauren Boebert placed on the table sent shockwaves through the House chamber. Tim Walz hadn't just secretly transferred money to Antifa groups. He had provided weapons procurement and logistical support for planning attacks. Those documents showed that the chaos in Minnesota had been deliberately orchestrated by the state's own governor. What happened in the next 210 seconds would expose the largest state-sponsored terrorism operation in American history and prove that Tim Walz had used his position as governor to fund, arm, and coordinate Antifa violence, while deliberately sabotaging law enforcement response to protect his terrorist allies. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's about to shatter everything you thought you knew about the 2020 riots and state government involvement in domestic terrorism, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You're about to witness the complete destruction of a sitting governor using his own financial records, proving he operated a state-sponsored terrorism network. The packed House Homeland Security Committee room vibrated with tension on this frigid December morning. The kind of charged atmosphere that precedes the exposure of crimes so shocking they redefined our understanding of government corruption. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing on state emergency management was about to become the most devastating revelation of state-sponsored terrorism in American political history. Sitting at the witness table, 37-year-old Congresswoman Lauren Boebert from Colorado had come armed with evidence that would destroy one of the most powerful governors in America and expose a domestic terrorism operation that had been orchestrated at the highest levels of state government during the most destructive civil unrest in modern American history. Her deep red blazer was impeccably tailored, her demeanor controlled and methodical, but those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes. The same relentless determination of a federal terrorism investigator who had just uncovered the most damaging domestic security breach in government history. Lauren Boebert had spent 28 months conducting what would become the most comprehensive investigation of state-sponsored terrorism ever undertaken by a sitting member of Congress. Working with FBI counterterrorism specialists, former ATF agents, and financial crimes investigators from the Treasury Department, she had assembled evidence that would prove how the 2020 riots had been systematically funded, coordinated, and protected by state government officials. Her team had obtained classified FBI surveillance reports, financial records from domestic terrorism investigations, intercepted communications between government officials and terrorist organizations, and testimony from law enforcement officers who had been ordered to stand down while cities burned. What they had uncovered was a terrorism support network that operated at the highest levels of state government while claiming to protect public safety. Across the committee room sat Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, 60 years old and radiating the kind of nervous confidence that comes from believing your crimes are protected by political connections and media allies who refuse to investigate progressive politicians. His navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair styled for television cameras, and his demeanor suggested a man who thought himself protected by his reputation as a moderate Democratic governor. Walz represented the ultimate progressive political success story, a former high school teacher and National Guard veteran who had climbed from small-town congressman to governor of a major state while building a reputation as a pragmatic leader who could handle crisis situations with calm competence. But behind the carefully crafted image of a steady crisis manager lay a much darker truth. During the 2020 riots that devastated Minneapolis and other Minnesota cities, Tim Walz had secretly operated the most sophisticated state-sponsored terrorism support network in American history, providing funding, weapons, and logistical coordination to Antifa groups while deliberately sabotaging law enforcement response to maximize destruction. He had survived multiple federal investigations through political connections and media protection, deflected accountability through carefully managed public relations campaigns, and silenced potential whistleblowers through a combination of government power and intimidation tactics. He thought his terrorist support activities were buried beneath layers of emergency powers and protected by the chaos of the riots themselves. He was about to discover that financial records create permanent evidence trails, even during declared emergencies. This confrontation was the culmination of one of the most extensive domestic terrorism investigations ever conducted outside federal law enforcement channels. Lauren Boebert had begun questioning the unusual patterns of the 2020 Minnesota riots 28 months earlier, when analysis showed that the destruction had followed specific strategic patterns that suggested coordination and advanced planning rather than spontaneous civil unrest. Her staff had started by analyzing emergency response records from Minnesota state agencies, looking for correlations between government actions and the tactical effectiveness of Antifa operations during riots. They noticed that law enforcement response had been systematically delayed, redirected, or canceled in ways that gave terrorist groups maximum opportunity to cause destruction while minimizing their risk of arrest. But the real breakthrough came when a former FBI counterterrorism analyst reached out to Boebert's office with evidence that financial transactions between Minnesota state accounts and known terrorist organizations had been deliberately excluded from federal terrorism investigations due to political pressure from Washington. This analyst, whose identity would remain protected, provided access to classified financial intelligence, surveillance reports, and intercepted communications that revealed active state government support for domestic terrorism. What followed was a painstaking process of reconstructing a terrorism support network that spanned state government agencies, terrorist organizations, and financial systems designed to hide criminal funding. Boebert's team had to verify financial transactions through multiple federal databases, analyze tactical coordination between government officials and terrorist groups, and piece together evidence from dozens of sources who had been intimidated into silence. They discovered that Walz had used emergency powers declared during the riots to create a parallel funding system that channeled state resources directly to Antifa organizations through shell companies, nonprofit organizations, and direct cash transfers that bypassed normal oversight procedures. The emergency declaration wasn't designed to protect public safety. It was designed to enable state-sponsored terrorism. Most shocking of all, they found evidence that Walz had personally coordinated with Antifa leaders to plan specific attacks on government buildings, police stations, and private businesses while ensuring that law enforcement would be prevented from responding effectively. The 2020 riots hadn't been civil unrest. They had been a state-sponsored terrorist operation. During the 2020 riots, Tim Walz had perfected a system for using state emergency powers to fund domestic terrorism that operated like a legitimate crisis response while functioning as a sophisticated terrorist support network. His operation relied on emergency declarations that suspended normal oversight procedures while creating new funding channels that could be used to support criminal organizations. The funding scheme worked through a complex network of shell companies and nonprofit organizations that appeared to be legitimate community support groups, but existed solely to receive state funding and transfer resources to Antifa organizations. These groups would submit emergency assistance requests for riot response, community rebuilding, and public safety support that sounded reasonable on paper, but were actually methods for channeling state money to terrorist groups. The terrorist support was coordinated through a sophisticated communication network that enabled real-time coordination between state officials and Antifa leaders during active riot operations. Walz's office maintained direct contact with terrorist coordinators, providing advance warning of law enforcement actions, tactical intelligence about police positions, and logistical support for weapons procurement and target selection. The most diabolical aspect of the operation was how Walz used his emergency powers to systematically sabotage law enforcement response while publicly claiming to support police operations. Orders were given to delay response times, redirect officers away from Antifa operations, and minimize arrests of known terrorists who were identified by surveillance systems. This created a perfect storm where state-funded terrorists could operate with impunity while law enforcement was prevented from stopping them, resulting in the maximum possible destruction while protecting the terrorist network from accountability. The House Homeland Security Committee hearing had been scheduled to review state emergency management procedures and federal coordination during civil unrest, with particular focus on lessons learned from the 2020 riots. Walz had enthusiastically agreed to testify, confident that he could use the platform to promote his emergency management expertise while positioning himself as a national leader on crisis response. He had no idea that Lauren Boebert had specifically requested to participate in this hearing because she knew it would provide the perfect forum to expose his terrorism support activities in front of committee members with security clearances sufficient to understand classified counterterrorism evidence. While Walz prepared to present his standard narrative about effective crisis management and federal-state coordination, Boebert was preparing to present the most comprehensive case of state-sponsored terrorism ever documented in American political history. The committee room was configured for classified discussions when necessary, with enhanced security measures that would prevent interference with sensitive terrorism-related evidence. Committee members and staff with appropriate clearances filled the secure facility, expecting to receive routine briefings about emergency management best practices and coordination procedures. None of them were prepared for what they were about to witness: the complete exposure of a state-sponsored terrorism operation that had operated during the most destructive civil unrest in modern American history, accomplished through the presentation of financial records, communication intercepts, and operational coordination documents that proved government complicity in domestic terrorism. The hearing began with routine presentations about emergency management procedures, federal-state coordination protocols, and lessons learned from recent crisis responses. Walz delivered polished testimony about Minnesota's innovative approaches to emergency management, emphasizing his administration's success in coordinating multiple agencies while protecting public safety during challenging circumstances. Governor Walz, Boebert began when her questioning period arrived, her voice carrying the authority of someone who held explosive classified evidence. During the 2020 civil unrest in Minnesota, your administration made extensive use of emergency powers and declared multiple states of emergency. Can you describe how these emergency declarations were used to coordinate public safety response and protect Minnesota communities? Walz's response was a masterful display of crisis management expertise, delivered with the authority of someone who had built his political reputation on effective emergency response. Congresswoman, the 2020 civil unrest presented unprecedented challenges that required innovative coordination between state agencies, federal partners, and community organizations. Our emergency declarations enabled rapid resource deployment and flexible response protocols that protected both public safety and constitutional rights. The answer sounded professional and competent, exactly what committee members expected to hear from a governor with Walz's reputation for crisis management. But Boebert had spent months preparing for this moment, and she knew that behind Walz's emergency management expertise lay a terrorist support operation that would shock the American people. She reached into her classified briefing materials with calculated precision, retrieving a folder marked with FBI and Treasury Department classification seals and placing it deliberately on the witness table, where every committee member could see it. The gesture seemed routine for a Homeland Security hearing, but experienced terrorism investigators immediately sensed that something unprecedented was about to unfold. "Governor Walz," Boebert said, her voice taking on the analytical tone of a counterterrorism specialist presenting case evidence, "I'd like to examine some financial records that might help illustrate how your emergency powers were actually utilized during the 2020 riots. I have here classified financial intelligence obtained through federal terrorism investigations that reveals how state emergency funds were used to support domestic terrorist organizations." The committee room's classified display screens flickered to life, showing financial transaction records that had been obtained through FBI terrorism investigations. The documents appeared to be routine emergency assistance payments, but detailed analysis revealed their true nature as systematic funding transfers to known domestic terrorist organizations. "These are financial records obtained through Treasury Department terrorism investigations," Boebert announced, her voice carrying across the now silent committee room with the authority of a federal terrorism prosecutor. The transactions were flagged by FinCEN anti-terrorism systems and investigated by FBI counterterrorism units as potential terrorist financing activities. Walz's confident expression began to shift as he realized what he was looking at. His face remained controlled, but committee members noticed increased tension in his posture and defensive body language that suggested someone recognizing evidence of their own criminal activities. The financial analysis conducted by federal terrorism investigators identified systematic patterns of state funding transfers to organizations with known connections to Antifa terrorist networks, Boebert continued, building the foundation for devastating revelations. Treasury Department analysis confirmed that these transfers violated federal terrorism financing statutes and constituted material support for domestic terrorist organizations. She clicked to the first financial transaction, and the screen displayed evidence that would end Walz's political career. Transaction dated May 29, 2020, during the height of Minneapolis riots. $2.3 million transferred from Minnesota Emergency Management Agency to Twin Cities Community Response Coalition. FBI investigation determined that this organization was a shell company controlled by Antifa leadership that used the funding to purchase weapons, communications equipment, and tactical gear for riot operations. The committee room fell into shocked silence as the implications became clear. Committee members stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing they were witnessing evidence of state government funding for domestic terrorism. Walz tried to maintain composure while offering a desperate defense. These transactions represent legitimate emergency assistance to community organizations providing riot response and rebuilding services. Riot response services? Boebert interrupted, her voice cutting through Walz's deflection like a counterterrorism scalpel. Governor, FBI surveillance confirmed that these organizations provided no community services. They existed solely to receive state funding and transfer resources to Antifa terrorist cells planning coordinated attacks on government buildings and police stations. She advanced to the next screen, displaying more devastating evidence. Transaction dated June 2, 2020. $1.8 million to Minneapolis Safety Network. FBI investigation determined this was another Antifa shell company that used state funding to purchase accelerants for arson attacks, tactical communications for coordinating assaults on police officers, and vehicles for transporting weapons to riot locations. The systematic nature of the terrorism support was becoming clear. Transaction dated June 5, 2020. $3.1 million to Minnesota Justice Alliance. This Antifa front organization used state funding to establish safe houses for terrorists fleeing arrest, coordinate legal defense for captured operatives, and plan the systematic targeting of minority-owned businesses to blame on opposing political groups. Boebert clicked through transaction after transaction. Here's $2.7 million for weapons procurement. Here's $1.9 million for tactical training facilities. Here's $4.2 million for communications equipment that enabled real-time coordination of terrorist attacks. Every dollar of Minnesota taxpayer money was used to fund domestic terrorism, while you publicly claimed to support law enforcement. But the financial records were only part of Walz's terrorism support operation. Boebert had also obtained evidence of direct weapons procurement for Antifa groups. Your terrorism support wasn't limited to funding, Governor. These classified ATF reports show that your administration directly facilitated weapons procurement for domestic terrorist organizations. The screen displayed ATF surveillance reports documenting weapons transfers. ATF investigation revealed that Minnesota Emergency Management Agency purchased 2,300 firearms, 150,000 rounds of ammunition, and tactical equipment, including body armor and communications gear, ostensibly for emergency response purposes. However, federal surveillance confirmed that these weapons were transferred directly to Antifa terrorist cells. Walz's face had gone pale as his weapons procurement activities were exposed. The weapons transfers were coordinated through your emergency management staff, who provided Antifa leaders with access codes to state armories and transportation resources to move weapons to riot locations. You didn't just fund terrorism, Governor. You armed terrorists with military-grade equipment. The evidence was comprehensive. ATF ballistics analysis confirmed that weapons provided through your emergency management programs were used in 47 separate attacks on police officers, 23 arson attacks on government buildings, and 156 assaults on private citizens during the 2020 riots. Your state government became a weapons supplier for domestic terrorism. Boebert's investigation had also uncovered the most damaging evidence, proof that Walz had personally coordinated terrorist operations in real time. But weapons and funding were only part of your terrorism support network, Governor. These intercepted communications show that you personally provided tactical coordination and intelligence support to Antifa operations during active terrorist attacks. The screen displayed intercepted communications between Walz's office and Antifa leaders, communication dated May 30th, 2020, from Governor's Emergency Management Center to Antifa Tactical Coordinator. Police response redirected away from Sector 7. Target buildings are undefended for next 45 minutes. State Fire Department response will be delayed to ensure maximum structural damage. The real-time coordination was shocking. Communication dated June 1st, 2020. National Guard deployment delayed until 0300 hours. Recommend accelerating Phase 2 operations before military assets arrive. State police have been ordered to avoid confrontation with your personnel. Walz's face was ashen as his personal involvement in terrorism coordination was revealed. These communications prove that you weren't just supporting terrorism after the fact. You were providing real-time tactical intelligence and coordination that enabled terrorist attacks while preventing law enforcement response. Perhaps most shocking was evidence that Walz had systematically sabotaged law enforcement to protect his terrorist allies. While you were coordinating with terrorist organizations, Governor, you were simultaneously sabotaging law enforcement response to ensure your terrorist allies could operate with impunity. Boebert presented evidence of law enforcement sabotage. These classified reports from FBI counterterrorism units show that your office issued contradictory orders to law enforcement agencies, delayed response authorizations, and provided Antifa groups with advance warning of police operations. The screen displayed internal law enforcement communications. Minneapolis Police Department report dated May 31st, 2020. Governor's office has ordered stand-down procedures for sector operations where Antifa groups are active. Officers are to avoid engagement and allow property destruction to proceed. Arrest authorizations have been suspended for known terrorist operatives. The systematic sabotage was documented. State Police report dated June 3rd, 2020. Emergency management has redirected available units away from known Antifa staging areas. Governor's office has classified these locations as off-limits for law enforcement operations despite confirmed weapons caches and terrorist planning activities. Boebert had saved the most damaging evidence for last, recorded conversations that captured Walz discussing his terrorism support activities. Governor, we also have recorded conversations where you discuss your coordination with Antifa leaders and your strategies for maximizing riot damage while protecting terrorist operatives from arrest. The first recording began playing in the secure committee room, and Walz's voice filled the space discussing terrorism coordination with shocking casualness. The emergency powers give us complete flexibility to redirect resources and coordinate with community partners. Law enforcement doesn't question emergency management directives, so we can provide whatever tactical support our allies need. An Antifa leader's voice responded, "The weapons transfers have been invaluable, but we need more real-time intelligence about police positions and National Guard deployment schedules." Walz, my emergency management team maintains direct communication with all law enforcement agencies. We can provide advance warning of any operations that might interfere with your activities. The key is maintaining the appearance of supporting public safety while ensuring maximum impact from your operations. The conversation continued with devastating revelations. The beauty of emergency powers is that normal oversight procedures are suspended. We can fund any organization, provide any resources, and coordinate any activities by claiming emergency necessity. Federal agencies won't investigate state emergency management decisions. But the most devastating part of Boebert's presentation focused on the human cost of Walz's terrorism support. While you were coordinating with terrorist organizations, Governor, innocent people were dying because of the attacks you enabled and the law enforcement response you sabotaged. The screen showed photographs and case files of terrorism victims. This is Officer David Martinez, Minneapolis Police Department, who was shot and killed by Antifa terrorists using weapons your administration provided. This is Sarah Chun, a small business owner who was beaten to death when police response was delayed by your deliberate sabotage orders. Walz's face was ashen as the human cost of his crimes was displayed. This is Robert Washington, a security guard who burned to death when your emergency management team delayed fire department response to protect Antifa arson operations. This is Jennifer Rodriguez, a mother of 3, who was killed when your state-funded terrorists attacked her car. The personal impact was devastating. 17 police officers were killed, 43 civilians died in attacks, and 234 people were injured because you provided weapons, funding, and tactical coordination to domestic terrorists while sabotaging law enforcement response. Walz made one final desperate attempt to deny the evidence. These allegations represent a complete mischaracterization of emergency management procedures designed to coordinate multiple agencies during unprecedented civil unrest. Emergency management procedures? Boebert's voice cut through the pathetic denial like a counterterrorism sword. Governor, you provided $47 million in funding, 2,300 weapons, real-time tactical coordination, and law enforcement sabotage to domestic terrorist organizations, while American citizens died from the attacks you enabled. She looked directly at committee members for her final statement. Every person with security clearance in this room needs to understand what we've exposed today. The governor of Minnesota operated a state-sponsored terrorism network that provided material support to domestic terrorist organizations while sabotaging law enforcement response during the deadliest civil unrest in modern American history. The final blow was comprehensive and devastating. Tim Walz, you didn't just fail to maintain public safety. You actively supported domestic terrorism using state resources while American citizens died from attacks you coordinated. Your terrorism support network ends today. As security officers moved to secure the classified materials and committee members sat in stunned silence, one thing was absolutely clear. Lauren Boebert had just exposed the most damaging case of state-sponsored domestic terrorism in American history using Walz's own financial records and intercepted communications with terrorist organizations. The fearless woman from Colorado had proven that no political position provides immunity from accountability when someone has the courage to follow the evidence and expose state-sponsored terrorism wherever it exists.